All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. We have Michael Keating here, and we have, let's see, 62 friends who are interested in exploring tokens. And I see some of those friends like Jasper and Ken and Sean and Ricardo and Anonymous are already in the Figma board where we will be spending the majority of this call. I just want to suggest prior to that, for those who are into having a Slack channel of other people that are exploring tokens and token design, this Slack that is now being put in the chat is the Slack that you'll want to join. You might say a nice GM in there, and we are going to do a little welcome exercise that we can kick off this call with. Let me see, I have all these screens open. I want to make sure I have the right one. If you can see the Fig Jam that Michael, Jessica, Daryl, and others are now in, I would like to direct your attention down a little bit on the board for a welcome exercise in Figma. Some of you might be like just for the first time signing into Figma, so you might have to go through a little Gmail flow to get in. Should be able to just authorize with your Gmail. And the kickoff, thank you, Alok, for pulling that down, is a super simple question that you can copy from this board. It's in KB7, I'd like to blank, and I'd hope if I can write it, the tokenomics guild can help by And I see people copying it. That's the way to go. It will eventually remove my name from it if we do this properly, and it'll say your name. At least that's what I thought it would do. Maybe when you start typing, it happens. I see Trisha has made that happen. You might have to like delete the message first. Let's see if we can figure out Figma. Yeah, Trisha got it to work. Army got it to work. Good. Okay, so then it'll have your name on it. And please just try to answer the question. I'll let the music play for a few minutes. I'll put the Figma files and so forth in the chat. You can see the collective intelligence brewing. Please enjoy, find a quiet spot. We'll play a song before we get into the meat of things. Okay. I guess that's our song-based cue to hold. That is Mordecai by Krongbin. If I'm gonna be the DJ today, I guess. Michael Keating, thank you, first of all, for putting together this big Jamboard board and for leading us through the wild world of tokens. What I was trying to do quite unsuccessfully was group some of these beautiful ideas. Would you mind perhaps maybe helping me group things, call out things that you see that are interesting here in what people are liking to explore? You're currently muted, but I'll introduce you in a moment. I'm just curious if you see anything that's calling to you.
This is amazing. I was looking at another part of the Figma, just adding some data about Wikipedia, Everpedia, and this is, oh my goodness, look at all the stuff you guys wrote. Okay, I'm gonna try to help Vivek do some grouping.
I'll start if you don't mind, but maybe others can as well. I'm just kind of like trying to create these boards, and thank you, Tyab, for helping with token design. I wrote meet people as like one of the ones. These particular token systems are things that I find interesting. People have said interested in dual tokenomics models, want excuse me, more attention on those. Another one on token communities creating healthy multi-stakeholder decision-making environments. There was another one that was over here that was on mechanisms for tokenization of real-world assets. And so if you do see any other ones that are like quite particular, I would like them to go over there in that left corner, if people might help me there. Thank you for the retail and e-commerce one. That's a nice new category. Looks like a lot of people are interested in meeting others who are interested. And so that would be the one trade-off of doing this in Figma, I suppose, is that like we're not all in Slack together, but just know that that Slack channel is intended as a place for continued conversation. So if you see somebody who's put a note up here that seems like it's in line with your own interests, perhaps make a mental note of it, know that this artifact will be here, this Figma board's not going anywhere, and you can explore yourself. Let's see. I wonder if I might call on a few people before, Michael, we get into it. Maybe if like Jasper would be willing to share. I know Avni has one about the initial circulation of tokens, voices of him, non-speculative tokens, just kind of going at random. But if any of you want to unmute, or if anyone else does, maybe we can kick off with your thoughts.
I'm willing to hop in if no one else wants to start. I think the thing that's the most interesting to me about, and sorry, I don't even know what the exact question is, so I apologize. But I think just to give you everyone a quick understanding of who I am. My name is Taib Hussain. I'm the CTO of Kasama, and my co-founder is Trisha Jose, who's sitting right there. Our long-term value or long-term vision is how do we help distribute ownership of the platforms that people contribute to. But obviously that is a long-term vision. That is lots of thorns along the way. Getting the tokens in people's hands is simply the first step. But afterwards, how do we make sure that people find value in retaining the token? How do people understand what even is a token? How do we attach value to a token? How does it not become an evil system where people are sort of just like grabbing, trying to gain power and control? I feel like there's an infinite number of things that I could probably go into. But the thing that I care about the most is how do we create long-term value for as many people as possible in a peaceful way. And that's the thing I'm really interested in.
Beautiful. Thank you, Tayo. Thank you. In a peaceful way is a beautiful way to end that.
Would anyone else as well?
Please, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Avni. So one of the questions that I've been curious about and really just trying to understand, it sort of is also a jumping off point from the last exploration, but it's one thing to create a token and again, as to distribute it. But I think for me, how do you incent the circulation? It's the cold start problem in this kind of space. And then not only that, like I'm very interested in how do you make every transaction not financial? So if you take a token and you think about incentives, it's easy to turn it into like a transaction, like a financial transaction that you have to put some kind of value on. And the stuff that I kind of work on and build on is the work of the communities. Work in communities with families, parents, all of that kind of stuff, and not some things people do out of the love of doing it. So is it reputational? Is it something else? But when you how do you have a token that has a value without valuing it in financial terms? So those are just some of the questions that I'm trying to just explore.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Ethne. Thank you. And it reminds me of this one right above. It says, I'd like to explore non-speculative tokens that still have utility while having value, and just thinking about how those things flow together. This sense of transactional value versus other forms of value is also something that, yeah, I think is really beautiful to think about. Cool. Army, I see your hand is raised, and then Michael, tell us when to stop so that we can get into Everpedia stuff.
Yeah, good morning or good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Army, and I'm here with my co-founder, Lucas, and we started that retail e-commerce section. So we're really interested in, one, how brands and retailers are implementing tokens into their marketing strategies. I'm sure a lot of people have seen developments in that regard, Starbucks, Nike, Adidas, and basically all these big corporate brands. But we find that they're pretty far removed from what's happening in Web3 on the ground. And so we just really want to start conversations and explore about not only what's possible in terms of marketing and engagement, incorporating the use of tokens, but also what sort of new value we can create for ourselves as consumers. So we have a lot of thoughts and ideas around that, and we'd love to explore it with everybody.
Beautiful, beautiful. That's wonderful, Army. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Okay. Well, the good thing is, oh wait, we have one more. If Rich Explorer, please go ahead.
Hi everyone, my name is Shubham, or Rich Explorer. So I think one of the things, I'm co-founder of Quest, and one of the things that we are really interested in solving is dual token system reputation using verifiable credentials, ERC20, 721, 1155, and everything. So would love to brainstorm with anyone on the same.
Beautiful. Thank you, Shubham. Rich exploration indeed. Okay. We will perhaps pop into, we're already in the Figma, which is great. I think this is more people in the Figma than we've ever had, Michael. So I hope this works well. I just want to introduce Michael Keating. He was with us in KB4. He at some point in the process just kind of like quietly mentioned, like, you know, a year and a half into knowing each other, that he used to do this case study method when he studied at Harvard Business School. That was a really nice way to explore ideas. And one thing that he had yearned for in the token communities track was a space where we could just like set a framework from which we could explore any token, whether it's a good token, a bad token, a token we agree with or don't, but have a constructive, collaborative conversation about what it is that could be. And so Michael, you know, other than that, has been working a lot in electric mobility and in general public goods and public spaces, and has most recently been working on a project called TEMPO, which is focused on bringing mobility infrastructure into cities, and the way that might be done using tokens to incentivize different groups to do things in the real world, and do it in a way that benefits a public infrastructure project, right? Like thinking about tokens as a means towards public goods. And so hard questions that Michael has to answer on a day-to-day, but with us, I think he has a slightly easier job, but still one to do, which is manage this Figma board and make sure that we stay on track for 40 to 50 minutes every week. But Michael, just, you know, thank you truly for being with us and for taking the lead on some of this.
Thanks, Vivek. I was in KB4, and I thought I was learning a lot, but I wanted to kind of try to apply it. And I thought it would be great to take some of the kind of broader principles that come up in the juntos and the weekly firesides and from Andy and Vivek and the guest speakers and see it just like, let's just talk about a specific token and try to apply the lessons of kernel to it and see if we can understand, why is this a special token if it is, or is it special? Is it great? Is it awesome? Is there something we can learn from this to apply to our own projects? Is it bullshit? Like, is it a scam? Is it like what can we, and there's, I think one thing I learned pretty quickly is that even within the kernel community of expertise, there's not a lot of people that really know how to design great token systems, economies, communities, projects, cultures, and it's a very, very new space. And it didn't take long for me and some of the other folks in kernel to realize that we were running out of people that we could talk to who knew enough about this, or at least had time to talk to us and teach us about it. So teaching ourselves and teaching each other became a high priority for me, and doing it in the context of a specific project, which helps ground the conversation and lessen sort of like aspirations and values, which is a very, very, very important part of kernel, and apply it to in whatever token people are particularly interested in. So we did that a bunch of times in KB4, KB5. We did it one during the empty block in KB6, and we recorded some of those, and you can check those out on the kernel website and the kernel YouTube channel. I should say, I guess, because we're recording these things, none of this is investment advice. I know that Vivek name checked Harvard Business School. I am not your investment advisor. It's I thought that school has a particular pedagogy which I find valuable, and I think, and one of it is this participatory method of teaching each other and not just coming in for a fireside and listening, which anybody here is welcome to do, but to offer your own ideas and share those with each other and test. This is a space, even though it's being recorded, it's going on the internet, which I think is maybe, Vivek, something we should discuss. This is a space where you should feel free to ask whatever questions you have, make whatever assertions you want to make, and share those with your trusted kernel peers who can help you come to a better understanding of tokenomics, which we're not, also, by the way, we're not allowed to call it tokenomics anymore. Alex says you're not supposed to call it tokenomics, so we may need to come up with a whole different name for this. But it is important to study this stuff, and it is important to bring, I think, kernel's values and kind of conceptual framework to it, as well as just the facts of these communities and these tokens. And so this is an opportunity to do that, and this is an evolving process. This Figma board is a place where we capture some of the frameworks we like to use for asking questions about these communities and the tokens that they are organized around. And some of them are great questions and relevant to all tokens, some of them are not, but it's a space where we can kind of explore and learn together. So having said that, I love that we started off with something more general about KB7 and people's interest in tokens and communities in general. And thank you all for sharing your thoughts and for helping to organize them on this board. And Vivek, if you think it makes sense, or if the folks on the call think it makes sense, we could dive into Evropedia, which was the nominated token for the week, and use that as a way to practice reflecting on these tokens and frankly analyzing them, as well as speculating about them and learning.
Let's do it. We're following your cursor, Michael. So as you zoom in and out on Figma, we'll
so why don't I take you for a quick tour of our Figma?
Hey, can I just interject?
Yeah.
If it's one fundamental question, before we dive into the token, when does a project really need a token, or do all communities necessarily need token? And how do you make the decision of, is a token right for my project or community or not?
So not all communities need a token, and I think if and when one creates a token is very, very, very specific to the community that you're building. I think that's a quick answer, and I don't have a more authoritative one than that. If anybody else wants to offer one, I should also say I've never issued a token in my life. So the reason I get held forth as an expert on this is because I stepped up to organize these groups. I'm really not a token or tokenomics or expert. So I'm doing work in the space myself, but I, as a sort of convener, assume that I'm really here as a facilitator, not as an expert. Lanomu.
Yes, hi, thank you. I wanted to dive in a little bit more into part of like not all communities need tokens. I agree with that, but I found that really interesting for several tools, for example, that exist for DAO. Some of these tooling requires you or asks you if you have whether you have a token or whether you have an NFT, so that you can demonstrate how governance is being done on chain, which I think is part of at least like what I'm exploring in KB7 is DAO, like governance in our DAO in particular, and how we can evolve that. So would also love to hear what other ideas others have on how to successfully have governance on chain without necessarily getting into the problems or the issues that creating a token involves.
I'll put one thing in the chat, but I think this is a really beautiful conversation. There's one research from article from Vitalik that seems relevant here. And I do think it comes up as we like start to explore tokens. Thank you for asking. Let's see, Rich and then Avni perhaps.
Yeah, I would also like to just jump in a little bit and tell about tokens of what we think about tokens. So there are multiple levels of tokens. So one is what we have classified is like membership tokens, which can be a token for your community like FWB or NFTs or whatever. Then we can have reputation tokens in terms of the contributions that you're making inside a community, the tokens that you're getting for those things. It can be soulbound NFTs, it can be verifiable credentials, it can be anything. And then comes the value layer, which is utility tokens, which are fungible or non-fungible, which you can literally use in terms of which can be traded, redeemed, or done or used in any of those forms. So the idea is in these three different kinds of layers, one is like governance or membership, the other one is identity, and the third one is value. Now, every community doesn't need to have a governance layer or maybe identity layer or maybe value layer. So it's just a mix and match of what you want as a community. If you want in your community that like we are not ready for maybe releasing a token, value tokens, right? Then you can just have reputation frameworks for members in your community that in future,
for African Americans, for Asian Americans, for Hispanic Americans, virtually every number was the best.
Inflation rate month to month was just just an inch.
We had the best stock market price ever.
I got that.
I'm laughing. Both Biden and Trump have joined us for the call, but please, Rich, if you don't mind.
God help us.
I got confused for a second what's happening.
But maybe no, if you don't mind, actually, Shubham, maybe you could continue in the chat with that framework. That would be really nice to, if you have anything that's written on that, and then we could go to Avni, and then perhaps.
Yeah, I'll just offer like a really quick thing. So in my exploration of this, and I come from the startup world, so a lot of this exploration is you don't really issue a token until you have some kind of product market fit. So there's not really it doesn't really make sense to focus on like a token. It's like just like you wouldn't focus on like a rewards or loyalty program in like a Web2 kind of framing until you have something. And so one example that I've seen that was really interesting to follow was the ENS kind of space where they already had a business, they had done a lot of things, and then they sort of drop the token. And the point is not, then you figure it out later. The point is you have an eye towards wanting to issue tokens, and you're logging like the transactions and the interactions that you want to value, but you're not actually worrying about the token until some future state where you actually have product market fit on the thing that you're trying to do. And that could mean that you have a healthy community that's transacting and whatever it is. It could mean a product, it could mean whatever, but I thought that was a helpful framing.
Okay, and this framework that we use here is evolving. So this Figma is not canonical. It's been evolving sort of session to session. The IDEO collab folks have been helpful in contributing to this and leading past conversations. And so if you have a framework, which Rich did and Avni and others have made suggestions, we can add this to the Figma, and we can add questions or templates or points of view on this that we can use as methods of inquiry into these tokens. And that's what this Figma board is intended to be. And there's no way we could get through every one of these things in an hour, even less. But there's one way of looking at tokens is to do a stock and flow diagram, which is part of what is happening over on the left side of the board, is examples of how you can diagram how tokens move through a community. We also, the community is in many cases the most important aspect of a token, and who are these people and why are they involved and what do they have to say, and what's exciting to them about the project. And over here we ask, sort of further to the right, we have general questions. You may recognize some of these from your kernel content, like what the idea that a token is something that transmits a fact. Well, what fact does this token transmit? And is there a fiction? And then we talk about defensive mechanisms in kernel, like how does the protocol view the importance of the defender's advantage? How does a protocol defend against cheating and explicitly define cheating or sort of malfeasance and explicitly design against that? So we like to ask those kinds of questions about our tokens. And then over to the right, this another sort of framework that's sort of homegrown, but is the idea that every token has macroeconomics, which are sort of like inflation, deflation, there's sort of the kind of its own little monetary economy, has microeconomics in the sense that most of these tokens and communities have a business model, so to speak, and maybe they make money some way, maybe they spend money some way, and there's questions of just like, how does the thing work? What are the individual incentives for people who participate in this network? And then finally, just about every token has a mean. Sometimes the token is all mean, but there's a narrative for this token, like a message or like a belief or an aspiration that a token has. And so we like to ask ourselves, what does this tokens mean? Like, what does it mean to people, and what is the message that you're sort of implicitly buying into when you buy that token and you participate in a community? So these are just templates, they're just frameworks with which to look at tokens, and we can approach Everipedia or any future token that we take on in tokenomic study group, through these lenses and see if it helps us understand what's actually going on.
Good.
And if anybody, Vivek, do you want to take it from there?
Let's see, Andy, so Michael, if you want to go back to like the facts and those questions, I'm curious if Andy has anything he might like to add here. We've gone through some of that, but the Tokenomics Guild is skipping ahead really to module 5 of the syllabus, which is called Tokens and Mechanism Design. And if this is where your focus is, I would note down module 5. There's a lot of stuff there that really is kind of the deepest well, but perhaps Andy could give a bit of thoughts on what's been discussed so far, and maybe how Michael has come to some of these questions which come from parts of the syllabus.
Yeah, module 5 is the place to go. I think that Michael has done a really good job of answering some of these questions. Like the question, does a community need a token? If so, when and how do you decide, is like literally the $1 million question, right? I think that saying that not every community needs a token is a good place to begin there, because it's true, but these can be enormously powerful incentive mechanisms, which necessitates a very particular kind of responsible engineering, particularly as you consider the effects that very, very minor incentive mechanisms have on the world at large. The best example of this is Bitcoin itself, right? 2 very, very simple incentive mechanisms. Longest chain, proof of work. And that produces a behavioral effect in the world that accounts for the majority of GPU purchases in the world, and 0.5% of the total power in the world is used to mine Bitcoin. So those 2 very, very simple incentives have like an enormous behavioral effect in terms of what people do in the world and how we make use of the resources available to us collectively. These are the kinds of facts that are then being talked about in like tokens as like that which teaches or transmits a fact. The notion of the transmission of a fact comes from the computer science use of the word token, which is the smallest significant bit of information used to transmit a fact. And this is fundamentally like what tokens are about, right? Like they're about like authentication and transference. right? I use that word particularly because like it comes from psychology, right? Transference is a psychological notion, but it also applies to the transaction and transfer of economic value in our world. And it's important to keep that in mind because tokens have as much to do with psychology and collective behavior as they do with engineering. And it requires that we are responsible in both dimensions in order to really understand what kind of facts it is that we want to transfer between one another and the environment that will create between us if we are each other's environment, which is what trust says today. So these transfer mechanisms are the kinds of facts that we're most interested in. And certainly like Kernel's perspective on this, which is not the perspective you have to adopt, it's just one that we particularly resonate with, is that transfer mechanisms ought to have a great deal to do with interdependence. And like, what are the kinds of transfer mechanisms we can create which help cultivate interdependence and reciprocity? There is, like good historical precedent for this. So if you look into the readings next week, you will see a piece written by Nick Szabo about collectibles, where he makes the point that if you look at like collectibles and the history of them, you will see that, for instance, in the Kula network ring in Melanesia, there were these like alternating circulating rings of necklaces and armbands that would move seasonally depending on resources and seasons across like the island chain. And what's really interesting is as these collectibles move in closed loops, they collect stories, right? So this was Chief V's armband, and all of a sudden it has like this economic value associated with the kind of shell that it is and its craftsmanship, but also because it belonged to a particular person. And the collection of those stories over time amortizes the cost of transport, i.e. it becomes more valuable, but it's the same weight and it costs the same to transport. So you get more value transported for the same cost. And like, that's kind of what I'm most interested in as it applies to tokens, and where I think healthy design can be done in terms of figuring out, like, does this community need a token? And if so, when? It's like, what are the ways in which we can use our tokens to tell stories about who we are such that their circulation within our community constantly accrues greater value for the same costs of creation and transport or transfer? That to me seems like a very interesting way of thinking about these kinds of things, and hones us in on the sorts of facts which are actually about like wealth and wisdom, right? Because like interdependence is the greatest kind of wisdom, and wealth is best represented through reciprocity.
Cool. Michael, we can, I think, take that forward at least and give it a go for Everpedia. What do you say? Any thoughts from the crowd before we do that?
So just to I'm clear, we want to pick a token and then do this exercise for that token.
That's right.
We picked a token for today already. It was
okay. Go for it.
What we generally do is about a week before the study group, we poll the community in the tokens Slack channel, and we say, hey, what do people want to talk about? Then people make their case for a token that they think is interesting that we should chat about, and then folks vote on it. And I think this process wasn't, most folks on this call probably weren't aware of that, but we did come up with Everpedia as an interesting topic to discuss today. I actually like the idea of using the first session of these tokenomics study groups just to sort of talk about frameworks in general, and I think and about people's interests and aspirations. So I think that was actually quite successful so far, and we may we've got 3 more of these in the block. Maybe in those we'll kind of cut more directly to the subject at hand. But I think in the next 20 minutes we can sort of use Everpedia as a kind of an example of how do we ask these questions, and are these questions useful, and what do we learn?
Got it.
Learn from them.
I think maybe I missed out and I did not see that. So I will cede the floor to people who are more familiar with Everpedia.
Let's do that now. Yeah, I think most people weren't tracking the token community's channel in Slack before this call, so that's okay. And we had, I think so far, a really interesting conversation about just the meta conversation around this, what this session is and what kind of tools we use. But maybe someone who is interested in Everpedia, or maybe has spent even a few minutes looking at it, do you want to answer any of the questions on this board, in the context of Everpedia? Are you interested in, the mission or the big aspiration of Everpedia and like what they say they're trying to accomplish in the world? You're interested in their business model? Do you think they have a particularly clever token design, or would you like to zoom in on some sort of more sort of kernel-like questions about like, the fact of the token, or like how it creates interdependence and trust and wisdom and value? Like, anybody who's excited about Everpedia or feels informed about it or wants to sort of kind of apply any part of the framework, the floor is yours.
Yep. Michael, while you wait on that, perhaps we go to the meme, at least that I know is in there, so that people can get a sense who have never seen it, and we'll put some links in the chat.
Anyone want to comment on any particular aspect of this? I'm not sure if Mike, Research Rabbit, I think, was actually the person who suggested this. I don't know if he's on the on this particular session, or but he nominated this token this week. So Mike, if you're here and you want to offer some thoughts on what was exciting to you about this be a time to step forward. And if you're not, that's okay. Love to hear from anybody else.
So I just did like a really quick read about it, and so my not very deep read on it is it's similar to Wikipedia, where they're trying to get contributors to add knowledge into a knowledge base, but they're particularly focused on blockchain knowledge. And then what they do for the token, and actually let's skip the token for now because we're not focused on that. I think that the focus is how can we use token models to create a new Wikipedia and actually reward contributors. It's my very non-deep read on it, but I don't know if that's what you were looking for.
So maybe you, oh, great. Joan, you want to step in?
Sorry, new to some. So I'm new to everything, so I may not have understood things correctly. But I tried to read a bit about Everpedia and the white paper that someone posted in the Slack, and I was just thinking that it seems to me that they are incentivizing, fast news. If you can post stuff on Everpedia that no one can really verify instantaneously, then it might be approved, and then you get points for posting that. Like someone else posted in the Slack an article about this guy that had been pointed out as the shooter in one case, and then it turned out later that he wasn't, but his name will forever be associated with the shooting now, and it seems to me that like there's no penalty for spreading fast news that may be fake, which I think goes against the me. I was wondering if that's right, or if I have misunderstood something.
I think that's right. And it's a good point to Michael's original question of like, what are the penalties in the system for breaking the rules or for cheating? I think Jess perhaps may have something to add.
Yeah, so just to like spur conversation, I think another way to put the meme of the whatever is like, we need a better Wikipedia, which I don't know that we do need a better Wikipedia. I think like the focus on blockchain knowledge is like, yeah, maybe, but I don't know. What does everyone think about that?
Maybe one way of asking it, and particularly if someone here is excited about Everpedia, they say like, if Everpedia was super successful and lots of people were using it, and like what would be like the amazing beautiful world that we would live in that they had made possible, and like how, and maybe the answer is like, I don't know, but or maybe there is this like amazing thing that could happen. Did anybody pick up on like what's the like dream of Everpedia?
I guess this isn't, I didn't like find this, but my inference is like people could be compensated for their, you know, the stuff that Wikipedia contributors do, which is like do all this like minding of like this information. And it's like it's like a full-time job, or I don't even know, like, I don't know how these people even do it. It's like really a really big task that a lot of people devote a lot of energy to.
Yeah. So, sorry, Vivek, go ahead.
Please, no.
So obviously all of these things are experiments, and I don't want to like criticize or like this is just something to point out, right? Wikipedia was successful without paying its contributors, and some would argue that it's actually a good thing that they weren't paid, because they didn't have any financial incentive to, you know, spam the system. You actually don't have bots trying to spam the system, you know, trying to make sure that they earn their keep. But actually, I was reading something about this. One of the big problems that not crypto, but in general, a lot of companies face is the problem of succession. So let's say there were all of these contributors who posted to Wikipedia, but you know, some of them are going to retire. Some of them, unfortunately, will pass away. So are there a new set of contributors? Is there an incentive to involve new contributors, new people doing things in the system to make sure that things are accurately kept up to date? And maybe it's early on, it probably doesn't do anything novel, but maybe it fixes something in the future around the succession problem. And again, this is just a conjecture on my end. On why it would be useful, but also it may not benefit the people getting the value from Wikipedia, but it might be good for us as maybe, I mean, I don't know the answer to this. Is it good for us to compensate people who are working on these public goods projects, or is it better that we kind of leave it as like a public service? And I don't know the answer to that.
Trisha, you want to jump in?
Yep.
Yeah, for sure. I think I've also done like very light minimal reading, just based off of the quick links that were sent. I do think that this is a really interesting use case around whether or not everything needs a token. And I think the financialization of those tokens, because the articles that I came across were about a lot of the fake news that were created through some of these contributors coming together. And what I obviously haven't been able to dig into in a short amount of time is whether or not those contributors were incentivized to create information because they were getting compensated financially. But I think someone posted in the chat, like, could this avoid some of the fake things that kind of proliferate Wikipedia? And it seems like the answer is not necessarily, because there's almost incentive to contribute information whether or not it is true. And for me, it's a really great thought experiment. And like, does everything need a token? I think that where the public goods question is a really interesting one that they have posed, because I do think tokens kind of change the funding model around public goods, but does that funding model extend itself to the contributors that now have different intrinsic and extrinsic motivations around contribution? Again, like, and just based off my quick read, it seemed as if a lot of the information on Everpedia today is quite sensationalist, and is quite focused on really polarizing topics. And I think that the question around, you know, do we need a better Wikipedia is an interesting one, because the answer at just, again, based off of the little information, is maybe not. And I think it's a really great framing, at least even for me, of someone building in this space of sometimes things don't need some of these token models around it. And it can actually cause negative actions potentially, depending on what public good we're trying to create. So just based off of my quick read, those are just some of the swirling questions in my head that came up.
I think one thing you'll look forward to in the fifth section of kernel is this idea that while I think a lot of people, when they first begin thinking about a token economy, they think about what kind of positive behaviors they want to incentivize. And so like that might be, in the case of Everpedia, sharing that people are interested in. But that it's also really important, as Vivek mentioned a minute ago, to think about the defense mechanisms and then maybe even more important to really think thoroughly through how you create the mechanisms that disincentivize or make it economically irrational for people to behave in a value destroying way on your network. And it may be that we're not seeing that with Everpedia, that maybe they did a good job getting people to post, but maybe not as good a job creating incentives to manage the veracity of what's on there. Ryan.
Well, you see, the thing is that, like, how do you manage veracity, right? Because one man's truth is another man's fiction, and that's just men. I'm kidding. The main point here, right, is that, like, even Juan, like what you say in the chat, like these facts that are put on chain are not verified to be true, because, like, who does that and how? And when you, like, begin to dig into these details, you begin to see why people say that, like, token engineering and incentive design or mechanism design is one of the most difficult problems there is, full stop, right? Like, if you look at, for instance, like language design, this domain of domain specific languages that people build is, in the estimation of people like Stephen Wolfram and, like, a lot of the most respected intellectuals in the world at the moment, much more difficult than theoretical physics or like high-level abstract maths, right? Like just language design, which is a tiny part of the world of mechanism design, language being a very particular kind of mechanism. You don't get to verify that anything is true. Things are established as facts, which are just values in time that change. Right? I mean, like, that stay the same as time moves on. So there's a wonderful video also in module 5 about exactly this thing from a man called Rich Hickey, who's the designer of a functional language called Clojure. The main point here being, right, that when, like, it's such a beautiful question, you know, like, do we really need a better Wikipedia? Like, no. And when you add incentives in this naive way, you do two things, right? The first is that you destroy intrinsic motivation, which is the whole, like, thing behind Wikipedia that is so powerful and that leads to, generally speaking, pro-social outcomes without encoding any particular, like, behavioral constraints. The other is that, like, and another nice example of this is Stepan, but when you provide mostly rewards, right, then people are, as was said already in, like, a very clear and beautiful way, they're incentivized to add any content, not necessarily that which is true. And then if you say, well, okay, we can recognize that, and so we go to, like, a second level and we say the content which is viewed the most or used the most or linked to the most or shared the most is that which we reward the most, and we have the sliding scale, then that incentivizes people to continue adding content and to continue adding the most inflammatory and divisive content, because that's what gets shared, viewed, or used the most, right? And so even second order cybernetic thinking doesn't really work, because you need, like, a multi-dimensional approach toward understanding what it is that you're actually trying to incentivize. Stepan was the same thing, right? Like, here's something which is ostensibly good. We want everybody to exercise. We want to reward them for living healthier lifestyles, for getting out, for getting away from the computer, for, like, doing a certain number of steps. Everybody, like, is obsessed with quantified health, and, you know, we can leverage that to pro-social outcomes. But if you think only in terms of rewards, then inevitably people game the system. You get this multi-party mutual collaboration which exists in extra protocol ways outside of the protocol, and that's, like, mathematically it's impossible to model fully in a game theoretic way, right? Like, multi-party collusion that is extra protocol can't be modeled within, like, the game itself that you design. So what you have to do is begin thinking about, like, punishments, right? Like some notion of, like, penalties or balanced rewards and incentives in your system in order for these things to really work well. And, like, that was the big step forward as we thought about consensus algorithms moving from proof of work to proof of stake, right? Was this recognition that if it's only about rewards, as it is in proof of work, not only do you get this massive behavioral shift towards buying up all of the GPUs and upsetting all of the gamers in the world and using 0.5% of the world's power, you also ensure that the only people who benefit materially from the network are the miners themselves. 99.9% of the rewards in Bitcoin go directly to the miners, not to the developers or other maintainers or critical actors within the protocol. And that is a very, very, very imbalanced incentive structure, right? It's one of the reasons that this particular culture has propagated within Bitcoin that doesn't allow for like more healthy, wholesome communal responses to the needs of the network, because the incentives are so deeply entrenched toward the miners and those who validate transactions in the network and away from anybody who would innovate. So of course the culture that is like given most impetus is that which is like most ossified in some way, right? And it's important, don't get me wrong, like I love Bitcoin and I think it's important that something remains stable while others can experiment in different directions. But like one shouldn't be surprised at that aspect of the culture, given the incentive structure and the way that it emphasizes rewards. So now, like if you look at the ETH2 incentive structure or like other proof of stake networks, there are all of these like inactivity penalties or slashing penalties, which are actually the heart of the protocol and go to what is really interesting about cryptography, which is defender's advantage, right? And like this is really like, once you understand that context, I think we can begin to think more broadly about like, okay, what is actually the way in which tokens or some kind of like community incentive mechanism could help services like Wikipedia? Because Wikipedia is not perfect, and they do really struggle with funding. This is like one of the things. If you go into Wikipedia today, you will see like, hey, we don't want to bother you too much, but would you mind donating $20? Right, and it's this like really annoying blue banner and you feel kind of bad about it, and it's like this weird thing. I just want to get the information, but also now I have to kind of maybe pay James and the crew, and like I feel kind of bad, but also I like it's Wikipedia and you go in this whole like I don't know, I certainly go into like this whole spin of like, should I pay, shouldn't I pay? They don't accept crypto. Like I'm gonna have to give them my credit card. I hate giving my credit card. And it's like the whole thing, right? So there's definitely like a means of like thinking about tokens and community design that would alleviate Wikipedia's needs to ask their users for constant donations. And that's interesting, right? And it goes together with thinking about how you would host it in a distributed way, how the hosting of that content might incentivize certain kinds of use, because, you know, like systems like IPFS and Filecoin, they pay people to host content which is like widely used. And it's these kinds of things, right, that are like interesting to consider. I think that everybody on the call has been like really insightful in terms of saying like this particular approach to things is A, probably unnecessary, and B, if it's like just rewarding people for adding content and content that is viral, like you're not going to get the same thing as Wikipedia. It's certainly not going to be better.
Yeah. I think you've given us a couple of good ones potentially for the next one. I know Michael will make sure we put them in the chat. One thing we'll end with for sure is voting on the next token. So we have 2 weeks until that goes. I wanted to offer if Katya would like to start from the bottom up. We saw maybe the best potential token designer was sitting next to you for a second there. I don't know if that was your daughter or somebody else. But...
yeah, that's my daughter who's running here. Yeah, thanks for giving me mic now that she's gone. She'll be back probably in a second. So I just, first of all, like maybe super plain question, are there like templates, Excel templates or something to actually calculate the tokenomics? I guess that will be later in the next weeks. So that would be helpful because they have a bunch of friends who are like tokenomic experts, but I could ask them, but maybe there are like some kernel hacks or templates we could use.
Yes.
And the second one, another comment, so I was thinking about, which would be really cool to tokenize. So Wikipedia for sure, but also something like making intros, so connecting people. So especially like in the world of like biz dev, startups, VCs. So there is an app which I'm posting now in the chat. It's called Bridge. So it's a Web2 app where you can like make intros and receive intros to people. And I think it would be really cool to have tokenomics for maybe this app, or build another one which is like a Web3 app for that. So yeah, maybe some thoughts on that, maybe projects like that exist. Oh, cool. Karen is, yeah, sure. Hook me up. I think it would be really fascinating to reward intros because some people are doing many and yeah.
Amazing.
That's it.
Yes.
Yeah.
We will share more on the token design frameworks. The token engineering commons has been around and they have some things that we can share.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, Shebnem is in KB7 again. She came back after, I think, being with us in Genesis or Block 2. So she's a good person to ask for those kinds of things. And yeah, we'll share more of those. Like the other thing is just like on this, right? Like just to kind of emphasize that we think that if we have a model in front of us, then we're like much more confident, right? And like, I just like be cautious of that kind of approach to things, right? Because like I make the analogy to language design very specifically because it's this kind of stuff that we're dealing with, right? Like language design is a subset of mechanism design. And if you think about designing a language, there's no single model for designing a language because it so much depends on what you want to express and the context in which that expression takes place. Right. And so like we can build CAD things and we can have like flow diagrams and engineering charts, and those do help, right? They're very helpful. And like the token engineering commons and 7 has some awesome stuff which we will use and which is wonderful. But like don't mistake the map for the territory. And if you are genuinely building a token, like you can use those things as inspiration, but like any good language, right? It is birthed from like an innate need, like necessity is the mother of invention, and from a genuine heartfulness about like what that need is in the world. And if those are the two things, then you hopefully won't destroy intrinsic motivation, and you will come up with something that is contextual and appropriate and healthy in the environment that you're operating in. So yeah, like I don't have anything against models, but just beware of like, yeah, mistaking the map for the territory. And that's basically it.
We're not going to teach you how to design a token, but we will try to give you good questions to ask. You know, both sort of big aspirational values driven questions of the kind that'll come up a lot in kernel firesides, as well as some very practical sort of detailed kind of questions that'll come up in these tokenomic study groups. And maybe through asking those questions about other tokens, you'll begin to answer some of the ones about your own, if that's something that you aspire to do.
Thanks. Yeah, it's always good to see a couple of examples or the right questions, at least, just to make your own thing.
Yeah, I know we're over on time. I want to be mindful of that. If we may, Michael, thank you for getting us going here. I think check out the Token Communities channel. That's where we will make votes for the next token, perhaps something slightly more technical, something we get deeper into the weeds of over 45 minutes instead of about 20 today. Thank you everyone for contributing to it. If you do want to stick around, we can stay for a minute or two. I know a few folks raised their hands, but thank you. Thank you for being here, and we'll be back in a couple weeks. If you have specific token things, put them in the channel. We'll, as stewards, definitely check on them, and as a group, perhaps collectively engage. So thank you. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Good to... I'll try to, but also Brian, Avni, Benz, please, if any of you guys want to kick off for the late crew.
I just wanted to jump off of what Andy was saying, because I think it's very, very important, this analogy of language. Can you guys hear me? Okay, yep. Sorry. It's this analogy of language being this like shared understanding, consensus amongst people. So if we look at language as a shared understanding and how language evolves, it's like language evolves by two separate people that have different languages figuring out how to come into consensus of the value or meaning that they're trying to communicate, right? That, to me, that consensus of understanding of what the value is, that's a market, right? A market is like two people coming into consensus about a shared value, right? So I think the thing that really interests me is that when we create these new marketplaces and build these incentives in the forms of tokens and whatnot, the way to build potentially around these biases of people just trying to make money and all this kind of stuff is, what does it look like to bring people together via just separate interests, right? So the marketplace that we have now in Web 2 is built on what I would say division, like dividing people onto separate interests, keeping them so that in separate pockets of the internet so that you can better monetize and serve ads to them. But how can we leverage the collaborative nature of blockchain and weave in incentives there so that you're bringing people with separate interests or dissimilar interests together to form consensus around something, right? And that to me is like, that's what language is. Two separate people as two different things, understandings of value, like coming together to provide truth to that. The other thing I'll say is like, when you're trying to figure out like what truth is, and we're trying to have people come together to determine what truth is, like that's potentially disastrous, right? But I think the only way we can determine, like the closest thing that we have to determine what truth is time. So being able to look back through ledgers and social mechanisms to figure out like what was right, what people group was right, how much more potential, trust do we have in that person or in this group because, this scientific study or this whatever it is like determined to have more value than some fake thing that was out there, right? Or some malicious thing that was out there. And then packaging all this stuff together in a tokenomics type of thing, it's like, it has to be able to pivot. It has to be able to change. You can't like spend 10 years coming up with a tokenomics, put it out there to like control people. And then the people need to be able to have agency to change these different things over time. So these tokenomics can't just be this one major like blockchain tokenomics type thing. We have to be able to modularize these things, protocolize them, give them power to people and groups so that the consensus that the smaller groups have together can change these mechanisms over time. So we're not just painting ourselves into a corner that, 2 years later or 6 months later ends up becoming a disaster. And we see all these disasters happen in DeFi. Now you try to do DeFi type mechanisms with social behavior. That's super dangerous.
Yeah, really interesting thoughts. Really interesting thoughts. I want to see what Ben's, if he'd like to add.
Yeah, hey, mine was kind of just a reflection really on the session there. I think we wanted to kind of explore the Expedia token, or sorry, what was it?
Everpedia, yep.
Everpedia token, yeah. And I think we assumed that token was being used to incentivize content creation, but I never found anything that was actually, that's how the token was used. And that kind of went to a conversation. But what I did find was that actually it was kind of, I think it was an Olympus DAO partner. And so it was actually a liquidity token that was used to, and that's a really interesting use case. I don't know much about it, but I know that they kind of hacked the way in which a community got capital. And it went with that model of like, we all get rich together, or we can only all get rich together, I think. And so I would have been really interested of like actually going through that and unpicking that and learning more about that. And then so I guess my reflection was like, it would have been awesome to have that session. And, or if we don't, I'm going to like definitely jump in the chat and be like, hey, can we look at Olympus DAO so I can, because I mean, the ability for a community to be able to raise capital and do amazing things is, I guess what, a lot of these issues are around like raising capital and a lot of people probably be interested in that. But yeah, just thought, yeah, and so maybe like we could even, if we're going to do like Everpedia token or something along those lines, I'm sure there's like somebody in Kernel had to know them. Maybe we could like invite them and be like, hey, you know the most about your token. Let's look at it or something along those lines.
I think I need to talk to Michael about it, because we've had trade-offs about that. We've had the people involved a few times, and the thing that we want to find a good balance between is that person being the person who has the information and everyone else. I think today we probably veered a little bit too forward to not as many people knew enough about Everpedia. So as I think about the next session, try to find that mix. We did do Olympus. And there's a link in the chat to it, but it very well could be one that we do again because the story has shifted since we had that.
Exactly. Yeah, it'd be really interesting because but yeah, awesome. I'll pass it on. Thanks.
And Ben's just quickly, that you're basically talking what I'm talking about. Like the mechanic behind Olympus is basically time. Like how can a community bond their time or investment in something to have shared communal value over time? And how does that thing, like from a treasury perspective, like grow and compound and all that kind of stuff? But you take that same mechanic of time and trust, take it from a DeFi mechanic and try to like imagine that and like social problem solving, and the mechanic there again is time, then yeah, I think a lot of these things come down to time.
Yeah, there's something really interesting there. I'm gonna try to pull some stuff out of the chat and put it into the channel. It's a tricky thing to do. We've been trying to be better about it. And it's funny because it's like the actual idea is like this idea of like archaeologists or historians. This is the idea in the source credit system that you cannot really understand the value of a contribution immediately. There's no way to get a sense of this, especially for like larger contributions right away. Like for a bounty, it's like a very simple task of, I want you to turn on dark mode on my website. You can kind of figure it out. The person did it, pay the person. But I want you to like create this new incentive or product. It's very unclear for long periods, like how valuable that is. And so source credit talks a lot about that in their system and this like this element of time. So yeah, curious thing to like bring forward. I do have to go right now, so I'll have to close the room, but really appreciate you guys staying late. And if you do have any feedback for the session, would appreciate it. We'll see you guys soon.
Awesome. Thanks, buddy. See you guys.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank you, Teresa. Bye, everybody. Bye, Jess. Thank you. Thank you.